This is the place. Chemistry lab should be on the other side.
Given my glacial production speed, there was something kind of serendipitous about releasing a video on the Ashes games the week before a new expansion, Hard Reset, came out. And with my criticisms of Afterglow, this seemed tailor-made to provide exactly the kind of linear action I wanted to see more of and thought was overshadowed by the increasing scope and complexity of Afterglow's hub areas. I think this mostly succeeds at that, another episode that makes the Enriched Edition seem more absurdly full than it already was. It made me realize that there was still more I wanted to say about the Ashes games as a whole. Then I guess the following is a combination of a review of Hard Reset and some scattered thoughts about the series more broadly at this point. Coming away from a couple of playthroughs of Hard Reset, my only problem is just the creeping feeling that it's a best of compilation for set pieces and levels from prior entries in the series. It lacks a truly unique identity of its own. While certainly understandable given that this is an expansion and not a full-on sequel, the striking thing to me is that it's home to a surprising amount of original assets and levels, and yet still ends up feeling like a retread of old ideas. Getting embroiled in the politics of dingy old towns and getting spooked when going through the tomb-like remains of old military bases. Great the first time around, but less effective now. So that's slightly disappointing, but what I wasn't expecting, and what was the best surprise for me, was the way it refined some of the fundamentals I thought were lacking in the earlier episodes, making the non-human enemies a much more compelling threat. Mutants get a new enemy added to the roster in the form of the Gladiator, a super fast, super lethal melee attacker. While there is a trend towards the newly included enemies feeling like pinkies with their speed, damage, and health dialed in at various settings, to the credit of the developers, these gladiators add a huge amount of tension into the types of encounters that often felt pretty rote by the end of Afterglow. They move so quickly and are placed with such a gleeful malice that they always got a reaction out of me. While they're still vulnerable to infighting, it's a much more deliberate process this time around. Now it turns into an especially tense game of chicken as you try and bait these tougher enemies into attacking each other. And in what will be a trend for Hard Reset, they strike a nice balance between being a good addition to the combat sandbox and serving as these dread-inducing props, giving even the most mundane combat encounters a nice horror flair. That said, there are some continued trends from the earlier episodes that I'm not a huge fan of. You fight these new human enemies, the Blackwater Bandits, that are highly lethal and pretty distinct as a new faction, but are only fought in a couple of the levels. As mentioned in the last video, fights against humans benefit from the fact that you can't get them to infight with one another. And combined with some especially devious enemy placement and open-ended levels, these fights are some of the most fun to pick apart in the whole series. While I'm glad the gladiators exist, there's still an underlying simplicity to them in the other New Mutant editions that still sees fights devolving into familiar strategies of circle strafing around groups until you've delegated all the work of combat onto the enemies themselves. Human enemies, and especially this lethal new faction, still demand more attention and are more tactically interesting compared to their mutant counterparts. And yet they still seem strangely underutilized. I think this could have been made up for, especially in the final trek to the Spire, with one last rematch against the Bandits, but I also feel like this might tap into the main issue of familiarity here. A seeming reluctance to really push the setting into some of the wilder places hinted at with some of Afterglow's late-game revelations. I regret not mentioning it in the past video, but one of the biggest omissions in the series, in my estimation, is that the combat still lacks any Archvile equivalent, something that could serve as a more interesting support role in the bestiary, and as an easy check against some of the problems that I felt Afterglow, and shooters of all kinds, continue to run into. For the SparkNotes versions of Archviles, these are enemies included in Doom 2 that can revive fallen monsters and can target the player with an attack that will do massive damage to you if you stay within their line of sight, putting you in a tricky position of wanting to prioritize killing them without getting too careless and getting killed yourself. Consider this one of the smart solutions to the doorway problem I mentioned in the last video. Enemies that meaningfully complicate your understanding of combat and change your relationship to the spaces around you. Cover turning into a liability if you hunker down and let them undo all your work. And for all the mechanical reasons it would benefit the game, it also seems like it would suit the supernatural elements that have become a major part of the series' identity at this point. A post-apocalyptic setting that's revealed itself to also be home to vengeful spirits and psychic mutants. Plenty of justification to incorporate an enemy type that could add so much to sometimes familiar fights, and maybe push the setting forward in ways that are still only being teased at this point, adding in some kind of mutant necromancer. There's shades of these kinds of complications with a new irradiated enemy. The standard variants are some of the most tedious to deal with in the series, but these big guys toss out projectiles that leave a lingering field of radiation. This means that you're discouraged from hunkering down around one piece of cover, as any hiding spot will be bathed in a lethal dose of poison. Combined with the cramped arenas you fight them in and the hordes of enemies they're assisted by, these make for some unusually hectic fights. Exactly the kind of improvisational combat that I think adds real life to a shooter. And these improvements to combat apply to the boss fights as well. Gemini was an extremely well presented but thoroughly lame fight in 2063, something you could pretty easily cheese by hiding in a corner of the arena. But the fight against Vanaya was a real highlight of the climax and Afterglow. Not just a tough and well-designed encounter given the way it forced you to move, but one that really helped sell the scope of the mutant threat, and served as a great gatekeeper for all the revelations about the true nature of the setting. This upward trend continues here, and the two fights against the Warlord are just as strong, encouraging you to stay mobile and to conserve resources throughout the entirety of Hard Reset just for these encounters alone. Lacking 1 or 2 spare medkits, turning this from a challenge to a nightmarishly grueling fight. So, despite the continued limitations, the surprising number of new additions generally bolsters the game and also has a nice side effect of making the older enemies a much more welcome sight. I can distinctly remember the feeling of relief upon seeing the original mutants after the introductory chapters throw such a gauntlet of new enemies at you. A nice release after so much tension. At the same time, the increased lethality here is also a nice way of selling the hostility of the world in ways prior entries shied away from. While there's a per level enemy count, some of these sections seem near impossible to fully complete with your finite number of resources. Even in its opening level, there's a massive ambush right at the end that I wasn't able to devise any sort of strategy for other than run away. This fight or flight dynamic is really highlighted with the Wendigos, another supremely tough new enemy that you're heavily encouraged to sneak past. While it's janky in practice, avoiding upsetting these cardboard cutouts of an enemy, it helps add to the prevailing feeling of danger that's dialed in here to a remarkable degree. You can fight them, but that means committing your limited ammo into these encounters, something that's ill-advised for almost the entirety of Hard Reset's runtime. I think there's a temptation to recycle a series' most iconic monsters ad nauseum, so the setting ends up being filled out by a handful of creatures. One thing I really admire about Hard Reset is that it feels like, separated only by a few years and a slightly different path into Atlanta, you could see totally different apocalyptic factions and ecosystems. It's certainly the most wholly unique part of the game, a mechanical pressure that makes it wonderfully grueling. As I said in the beginning, even for all that, in some ways it does feel like it's playing the hits, which is almost inevitably the nature of prequels and expansion packs. But unlike some other expansions that have offered radically different perspectives or even more drastic mechanical changes, Walker as a new playable character feels far too similar to the Scavenger of the main story. Another loner who gets roped into the hunt for a rogue AI. One of the ways Hard Reset is meant to be distinct is that Walker is supposed to be tougher but less tech-savvy than the Scavenger, but it's a detail that seems imperceptible in practice. The real point of distinction between the two characters comes strangely late into Hard Reset's runtime. Walker is imbued with a life-giving power that also gives him strange visions and degrades his mental state. Narratively, it's a really uncanny effect, seeing these apparitions appear in the middle of dialogue, and mechanically, the increase to your health makes the tougher fights of Hard Reset more enticing to jump into. I'm surprised that this wasn't the main catalyst for the expansion. Have a couple of familiar levels and then get granted these powers much earlier on, maybe tie them into finding the briefcase that so many of the factions are vying for. Because in practice, you only have a few levels to appreciate your increased health, and because of the modularity of weapons, Walker actually ends up being about as tactically accomplished as the Scavenger of the main game, constantly trading out ammo types and add-ons for whatever suits the situation at hand. I wouldn't belabor the point if I didn't think there was potential here. With all the factions and perspectives that have been shown so far, I do think the role you actually end up inhabiting is just too familiar to what came before. While it might override some of the earlier points I made about the scrappy action here, having a beefier health bar might make those near impossible fights a little more viable, serving as another angle to further distinguish Hard Reset. This familiarity is a shortcoming that could have been buoyed somewhat by the narrative, and the series' increasing interest in creating a fuller role-playing experience. 2063 was a fairly linear shooter with a nice RPG flair, but Afterglow had optional quests and ending slides, and now Hard Reset has character portraits and voiced NPCs.
Name's Speaker Lucas. This checkpoint is Blackwater Bandit's hurt. We don't take too kindly to strangers back in.
These additions go a long way in legitimizing these portions of the game, but if there's one thing I've been surprised by, it's that despite the seeming weakness of the setting, and for all its additional features, there's a surprisingly uncomplicated moral compass at the heart of the actions that makes these choices less interesting to engage with. In both Afterglow and here, there seem to be some unambiguously good factions, with raiders and bandits being just as short-sighted and awful as they initially appear. I'm not someone who thinks that all choices need to be morally gray, but I think for a series that has seemed increasingly interested in adopting these role-playing elements, I'd like their decisions to feel like more than opting to unlock content or not, or choosing between an obviously reasonable and decent side or a chaotically evil one. In Hard Reset's case, it's guilty of both, and doesn't capitalize on having a doomed protagonist that could be used to make some tough or unpalatable choices that might not sit well in a mainline title. And if I'm addressing issues I didn't discuss last time, then I may as well go all in. As a Georgia native, I've struggled with discussing the series, as it's both incredibly cool to see my home state depicted in a game like this, and also a little disappointing in practice. Scrub the name off any of these locations and they could be almost anywhere in the United States, or more to the point, interchangeable with any number of post-apocalyptic game backdrops. Aside from its retro aesthetics, there's not a huge amount distinguishing this Armageddon from any other at a casual glance. Even the secret area in Afterglow is probably going to read more like an extended Fallout reference than a riff on Atlanta being the home of Coca-Cola. There's an admirable attempt to capture the Georgia landscape in places like Afterglow's second hub area, or its finale in the mountains, but I imagine it's far easier to block out industrial cityscapes via GZ Doom than it is to create the kind of mountainous, decaying vistas that are synonymous with Appalachia. It may also be due to the fact that the series has yet to rely on hillbilly or redneck tropes, which in some ways is a nice relief, but may have also been an understandable and useful shortcut for establishing the local flavor. And critically, Georgia has sort of a hazy, anonymous vibe that's supremely hard to capture. Lacking some of the iconic landmarks and features that give other regions so much of their identity. It can be kind of boring, is what I'm saying. I might have to call it there, though. There's a fine line between criticism and whinging, and I'd hate to fall squarely into the latter category. So that's Hard Reset. While it may end up being a little too familiar overall, I think its improvements to the fundamentals of combat are genuinely great, and I really hope they carry forward into any future entry. I also want to say the team has been really open about the development of the series, particularly the burnout around Afterglow, which seems only natural after dedicating so much time to such a massive project. So maybe, more broadly, I hope this team knows how strong these titles, especially taken as a collective, really are. Ending looking towards the future is always a temptation of mine, but I hope that they can rest easy for a while, knowing that Ashes, as is already a modern classic. Thanks for watching. And they just announced another one. Probably gonna be pretty good.